Now, everybody knows who follows me that I struggle with anxiety. I live with anxiety, and some days are quite debilitating. And in the more recent, I'd say, couple years, a lot more in the last year, I've been much more open about even those bad days and giving some more details. And I find that it's been very freeing, actually, and a lot of people are supporting me. But even though I'm a clinician, I've always felt some stigma about having anxiety, and it has probably intimidated me and prevented me from sharing my story, even though I'm a clinician. And I would never advise my client to do what I was doing. I was doing it. So even as a professional, I was stigmatizing mental illness. And today we've got a mental health advocate, Jason Finucan, on with me. Hi, Jason. He is an author. Yesterday was his book launch. Really exciting. Here, let me show the book. Jason 1, Stigma 0. An amazing story about Jason's struggles and his challenges. He has bipolar disorder. He was diagnosed, I think it's in your 20s. You can get into that in a minute, Jason. And he also had some physical problems as a young child as well. And through those experiences, he's learned firsthand a lot about the stigma of mental health. And now he is out there fighting the stigma through his work, conferences, obviously the book, and he does a lot of employee awareness programs as well. Thanks, Jason, for being here.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's my pleasure.
So congratulations on the book launch yesterday. You were selling, when I was there, first of all, I had to stand in line. And you were selling a lot of copies, so I'm really proud of you. It's great.
Thank you. It was an amazing experience. I'm a first-time author, so this was obviously my first book launch, and it was thrilling to see that amount of support. And I just want to thank everybody who came out and who showed interest in the book.
Yeah, it was really good. So before we get into why you started this book and why you started to share your story, I want to talk a little bit about your background. I know that as a young child, you had heart problems and ended up having a surgery. And then later in your life, you had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. But there were some things that led up to the diagnosis, which are outlined in detail in your book. Tell me just briefly about the physical problems as a young child.
Yeah, that was honestly a very rare and it's just a bit of bad luck, really. I was born with a nerve defect. For those of you out there who are in the medical profession, it's called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. And it was not life-threatening, but it was very debilitating. And the only way to correct it was open heart surgery. So I was very lucky that I was able to have that surgery at 12 years old and come through it well, healthy, no pacemaker, no major side effects. But what I didn't know was I was getting an education in what it's like to have an illness that doesn't have a stigma around it.
Exactly. So when you have this open heart surgery as a young kid, what kind of support came pouring out?
Overwhelming, unanimous, and endless support is what I could honestly say. It was phenomenal. From friends, family, my teachers, anyone in my life who found out that this was happening to me, they rallied around me and they made me feel like I wasn't alone, like I was supported, I was loved, and it made a huge difference. It made the whole experience just that little bit less terrifying, which I'm extremely grateful for. And as I said, I had no idea that the word stigma didn't exist in my mind at that age and at that time, but I really was learning what it's like when people don't have a stigma towards an illness. This is how they behave.
Yeah.
And it's how we should behave when somebody has an illness. We should rally around them. We should help them.
Be compassionate, be empathic, which is what people were doing, offering support. So now your mental health journey, I know the diagnosis came a bit later. How many years was it from when you first started having symptoms? Because I know first it was depression before it came to the hypomania and then the manic episode, which led to your hospitalization. Yeah. Tell me, what was the span between when you were first having symptoms up until the time that you ended up in the hospital?
It was nearly 3 years. It was almost 3 full years. And part of the reason that took a while to get diagnosed was me. It was because I had an enormous stigma towards mental illness and towards the idea that I might have a mental illness. And strangely, I didn't even know I felt this way until I faced it. But it was very clear to me that the idea that I might have clinical depression or bipolar disorder or any other mental illness was a frightening terrifying thing, not just because of the illness, but because I felt it brought some sort of shame or some sort of judgment against my character. And I wasn't only worried about what other people thought. I thought these things.
Yeah.
I say often in my keynotes, and I say it in my book, I was part of the problem that I'm now trying to solve, which is that I fell into the trap of stigma. And I didn't treat my symptoms like an illness. I treated them like a character flaw, like there was something wrong with me that I should just try harder and figure out.
Yeah. And
so
I think
it delayed things.
Yeah. And I think that's what happens with a lot of people. And even I was just, as I was opening up, telling you that I'm still doing the same thing to myself. And when I think about my anxiety and maybe different things I can pursue to relieve some of my symptoms, I'm still judging myself and I still feel ashamed sometimes. I'm a work in progress as well. I'm curious, so Jason, I know your mom also, I know she's not with us anymore and I'm sorry for your loss. I know that she also suffered with clinical depression throughout her life. So do you think part of the reason why you were stigmatizing and judging yourself is because of what you observed happening with her throughout her life?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's because both my mom and my dad, I was able to reconcile all of this, thankfully, before my mom passed. My dad is still with us. But the reality was, when they described what it was like for my mom, it was so much worse than it was for me at 26, because she was in her late 20s, early 30s, and she was going through horrible, horrible depression, clinical depression for months at a time, and treatment wasn't working. And there was this the stigma that kind of just said, hush it, don't talk about it. So as a kid, I just observed, well, my dad seems good and my mom seems not quite as good, and I didn't know one was ill and one wasn't. So I actually spent a good portion of my life thinking my mom didn't have a strong character, thinking that she wasn't trying hard enough, or thinking, that it was something she could be doing differently. It took me a long time to figure that out.
When you just said that, Jason, I'm sorry for that ding. I still haven't figured out how to turn off my notifications on my computer. So you're going to hear ding, so I'm sorry.
No problem.
When you're talking about your mom there, and you said, my mom was ill and my dad wasn't, it sounds like they weren't upfront with you as well, because perhaps if someone had explained it in that way, it would have made sense. Like, I know for myself this weekend on Saturday, I was not having a panic attack, but I was almost getting there. Saturday, and I was having a really hard time at lunch. I couldn't sit still. I started getting up and I started pacing. And my kids were going, what's wrong, Mommy? And I'm like, my anxiety is really high right now. I'm really struggling. I feel like I'm going to have a panic attack. And my son, who also has anxiety, said to me, okay, Mommy, sit down, plant your feet. He started giving me all the techniques that I can, which is lovely. So I don't think they're looking at me like something's wrong with her. I think they're just recognizing it's just symptoms of who I am. So what did your dad tell you when your mom was super depressed?
I was really young. You have to remember, this was happening when I was between 8 and 13 years old. And so there wasn't a lot of direct talk about it. I don't think either my mom or my dad really knew how to handle it. They knew mom was going through, struggles. And certainly it was clear that she wasn't well, she wasn't happy, but it was never understood as an illness, like a mental illness, or if she had cancer, of course, we would have spoken about it openly. And that's something that they regretted. Later on in life, they said, we wish we knew how to talk about it. We wish we understood it better. But the stigma really got them. And I believe a big part of what we're trying to do now is change that culture that we lived through for so many years. And we can do that. We absolutely can reframe the conversation around mental illness so that people recognize it for what it is.
So let me ask you something about this illness. And I know we've moved away from my question that I asked you about the period of time. You said it was 3 years when you were diagnosed, and I hope we have time to get back to that. But you keep using the word illness, and I'm mimicking you and using the same. Honestly, I struggle with using that word because I feel like it puts a negative feeling on mental health, and that's part of the problem. But you're very clear about using the word illness and saying that we need to own it as an illness. So convince me, because sometimes I'm actually uncomfortable with that language. So why is that so important to use that word?
For me, the heart defect, really, it all comes back to that. So how would I describe what was wrong with my heart? I use the words heart defect because that's what it was. It was a nerve defect in my heart. I'll use that phrase. Or it was a physical illness rooted in my heart. There is no negativity to any of those statements. And when I say them, no one ever thinks that I've done something wrong. Everyone understands that a part of my body, in this case, my heart, isn't working right or didn't work right. And I believe that when we charge mental illness with such negativity, that we are actually allowing stigma to thrive. And if you simply look at it as, okay, you happen to have in the clinical terms, an anxiety disorder or a mental illness called anxiety. I believe I have an illness called bipolar disorder or a mental illness called bipolar. To say that I have, for example, mental health issues is an example of trying to twist the language to make it feel maybe a little, to avoid that word illness. But I think that leads us to a worse place because we don't say the indirect things about something like a cancer, for example. We don't say somebody has cellular health issues in their breast for someone who has breast cancer. We say they have breast cancer. Right? So
Cellular issues. I'm sorry.
yeah.
It's so true what you're saying. I'm not making light of breast cancer. I'm just saying it's very interesting when you're switching up the language like that. It's totally true.
Yeah. Language is powerful, and unfortunately, the truth is, the concern about the term mental illness for me, if I could change something, it actually wouldn't be the word illness. It would be the word mental. Because the one thing about mental illness that bothers me, the name, is that when you say physical illness, you understand that to be part of the body. If you say mental illness, it's very easy to misunderstand that to mean the mind, which makes you think of the character of the person. Whereas if I say brain illness, now you understand that as a physical illness rooted in the hunk of meat inside my skull called my brain. Every mental illness is exactly that. Every mental illness is rooted in the biochemistry of our brains. And so why aren't we calling it brain illness? And that was not done on purpose. That wasn't strategic. It just the way the medical community developed the names, it worked out that way. But truthfully, certain illnesses that are almost equally rooted in the brain as bipolar, anxiety, and depression, they're called brain illnesses. And these other illnesses are called mental illnesses. And I feel like that's maybe, in a perfect world, we would get rid of the word mental and call them all brain illnesses. But we're not there, and we're not going to get there overnight. So my attitude is, call it what it is. And that's how you take away stigma. You call it what it is. And it doesn't matter what the stigma is about. It could be mental illness, it could be sexuality, it could be anything, it could be race. You call it for what it is, and you demystify it, and you take away the negative power.
I just love that you just said that, to call it brain illness. That's so interesting. And when I said challenge me, convince me, you're really making me think about the way I am talking about it, because I say that I live with anxiety, because I don't want to use the word suffer, because I feel like suffer implies that I'm not doing extremely well and happy, which I am. So I try to avoid that word.
But that's okay. I understand that. I happen to feel comfortable saying, I suffer from bipolar or I have bipolar. But I respect why someone would say, I'd rather not use the word suffer from. I live with. That's actually using language in a good way. That's very positive to say it that way. So that one I really genuinely don't think is bad at all.
Yeah, and the word mental too, to go back to that, Jason,
Yeah.
it's like, I think of how we use that, like something's not working in your life and you're having a hard time, you're like, oh my God, I'm going mental.
Exactly.
It implies it's like negative, I'm losing my mind, something's wrong with me, I'm not coping. And that's not what this is. This is about cellular changes, or someone with PTSD, literal hippocampus changes.
Yep.
That the shrinking of parts of our brain because of trauma, things like that. There are these physiological changes. Okay, so I'm going to start thinking about it. I want to move on to something else, Jason. Do you think that it's different for men in terms of their willingness to self-report or to even seek help? Do you think it is different?
Unfortunately, yeah, it is. I don't know. It's funny. I never thought of myself as a typical male in the way that I thought, but I definitely fell into that same trap of just having a very hard time at first speaking openly about something that perhaps made you, overly vulnerable, or seemed to show weakness or something like that. And I'm genuinely not someone who is defined very much by machismo or ego or any of those things. So if it can happen to me, it can happen to a lot of guys who are more defined by those things. And unfortunately, there are many men out there who they've been trained that their strength physically and their strength of mind is a part of their identity. And if they lose that, somehow that is negative about them. But something fascinating happens is I don't hear many men who are facing something very serious like cancer. And let's say, I mean, I've known one person who got all the way to stage 3, lost 50 pounds, went through chemo twice, and then rebounded and came back. And it's amazing. This person is alive today. But as the person went through it, they didn't feel like they had lost their identity or their manliness. They felt like they were sick. They were sick with an illness. This cancer was attacking them. And that's exactly how it should have been looked at. But with a mental illness, often they think, I've failed.
Yeah.
I'm not strong enough. I'm not good enough. It becomes part of identity. And that's what we need to change. Mental illness is not our identity. It isn't. It's what we live with. It's a challenge we face, but I'm not defined by my bipolar disorder. You are not defined by your anxiety.
Right.
Period. It's a challenge you have to face, and it's something you live with, and all of those terms are very real, but it's not who you are. And so I think that's the key, is recognizing that it's not a failure. You, Stephanie, have not failed.
Yeah.
Thus you have anxiety, and me, Jason, has not failed. Thus I have bipolar.
Right. So now talk to me about writing the book, because I want to make sure we get into that. What made you go from sharing your story publicly, which you've done, but actually taking the time? I can't even imagine how long it took you to go through this process, and it must be horrendous. I have 2 books that I've started years ago, and it's just so hard. It's so hard to find the time and to get through it. What made you want to put this in writing and take it to the next level?
The response to my in-person lectures. So the response over years, I started doing it in 2006, and from 2006 to now, I'm well over, I don't know, 100 or more lectures that I've given, and to thousands of people combined. And the number of people who've come up to me after those talks and said, "This helped me," or "This will help my mother or my sister or someone," it was realizing that my story was resonating and was giving others some form of hope or optimism or motivation or a sense that they could do the same thing. They could overcome stigma and manage their mental illness. And I had this idea in my head, maybe I need to write a book one day. And then when I was forming my company, Stigma Zero, back in 2015, I brought some people around to a meeting, and I got their advice on some of the aspects of the business. And one of the people at that table turned to me and said, "So you're going to write a book, right?"
Yeah.
And I said, "You think I should?" And they were like, "You really should." Like, so that gave me another boost towards doing it.
Mhm.
And then Stigma Zero has grown a little bit in the last year. I have a new partner now. And when him and I joined forces 18 months ago, it was last March that he and I sat down and I said, "When do you think I should write the book? When is it worth me directing my time to writing this book? Because, it's a huge time." And he looked at me and he said, "Yesterday." Like, the sooner you write it, the better. And so that was the final, like, okay, it's a business thing, and it's a personal thing, and it's a societal thing. And so I sat down and started writing it last April.
That's really impressive that you wrote it and got it out in such a short period of time. Okay, so you're shaming me now. I've started 2 books years ago. Okay.
Hey, Stephanie,
Right. Well, I'm gonna try.
There's an important thing to remember. I have no
so
kids.
we're getting close. Yeah.
It makes it a lot easier if you have no kids. That does help. You're
Yeah, that's true. You're right. I have children. Thank you.
Yes.
That's true. I am a mom, so that does take a lot of time. So before we finish up,
Yeah.
Jason, how do you think people can help themselves? In other words, when I've shared my story, I've had some great responses. When you've shared your story, you've had great responses. So what would you say to someone about, go ahead, take a risk, share your story?
What I would say from the personal experience of getting up and telling your story, there is something amazingly cathartic about it, because you really can't get up and tell your story unless you've found a way to accept everything you've gone through, to have worked through it, to have begun to own your illness, manage your illness, and feel like you're in a position of strength, or else you wouldn't want to get up and be comfortable getting up. So let's say you are in those positions and you can stand up and share your story. It will help you reaffirm your own health. It'll help you reaffirm your own strength. And there is nothing more beautiful and satisfying than taking a horrible experience you were forced to go through and sharing some of the nuggets of wisdom you learned along the way and watching it help another person who's back in that place you were in. That is a heartwarming and an amazing thing. And that's what the book is about too. I mean, the idea that my book might be in the hands of someone who's at the depths of a terrible depression and it gives them some hope, that is incredible. And that's what I wrote it for.
Yeah, what you hope people get out of it too. So, and what can we do to fight stigma? So for anyone who's watching who says, you know what, I understand where Jason's coming from. We need to not shame people. We need to support them. If they're not struggling with any mental illness, I'm saying the word, what can they do to help change the way that we're viewing mental illness?
My shortest answer to that is simply start treating mental illness no differently than any other illness you can think of. Come up with a list of 10 illnesses that you know very well. Cancer, diabetes, just go down the list of illnesses you've seen people face and ask yourself, did you judge them, have stigma towards them? Did they judge themselves and have stigma towards themselves? And the answer is always no. So we simply have to do that with mental illnesses. We have to do that in a consistent way so that all illness is treated the same and the door is open for empathy.
Yeah, that's great. So Jason,
yeah.
1, oh here, Jason 1, Stigma 0. I've got my copy. It's been signed. Look at that. Actually,
with pleasure.
Jason, where can people find it? Amazon, I guess?
Actually, the easiest way is to go to my website at stigmazero.com/book. And on that page are all the links to all the retail outlets where you can get the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you, Jason, so much. I wish you the best of luck on your book tour and all the interviews that my fingers are crossed that you're going to get and keynotes that come out of it. And I really appreciate it. And Stigma 0.
Thank you very much. It was lovely to chat with you, Stephanie. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming yesterday to the book launch.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay. Bye, Jace.
Bye-bye.